I just wanted to get your perspective on kind of the future, the state of our nation pertaining to watershed health and societal health. Do you have any comments you'd like to make on that subject?
Yeah. I think the future of watershed health in our nation, and I like to think of in the world as well, it's easiest for me to think of those things with story. And so I think of the story of transformation that water has to tell. And it reminds me of a watershed that's dear to me and that I thought about a lot these last few days in Patagonia, in Torres del Paine. And the reason that I think of it as a healthy watershed is because you can drink from it, as humans can drink from the rivers there and the lakes. And the other thing about that watershed is the movement of it, that there's water trapped in glaciers that has been still for a very long time, and that's slowly, of course, melting, and sometimes in large chunks it's melting and falling into lakes and making these explosive noises. And so the watershed is very much alive in that sense and moving. And then as the water falls from these glaciers, it sits in these lakes and then gets pushed into rivers and has more movement flowing into rivers. And I had an experience at the edge of one of these lakes and rivers where the wind was so strong that we had to lay down on the trail because it was literally blowing us over. So we were laying there waiting for the wind to calm down a little bit, and as we did, the wind was picking up the water and blowing these rainbows right over our heads. We were laying under rainbows just blowing like this, and it was the full cycle, I think, of water then being lifted back up into the air. And I think that that feeling of this watershed constantly in motion and transformation is what makes me hopeful, I think, about the future of watersheds, because I think our relationship to them is also, I think, constantly transforming like that. And so I think there's a lot of space for us to realize what we have been doing that is not leading towards healthy relationships, and the power, the flexibility of watersheds to give us space to remake decisions and reimagine, I think, our relationship to watersheds. So I have lots of hope.
So I think that you have expressed a really intimate experience being in a watershed and connecting to that watershed. Mm-hmm. How do we allow everyone that experience?
Mm-hmm. I think a few ways. The best way, or at least for me the best way, is to be in watersheds, to spend time in them and experience them, to hike through them and swim through them and fish in them, do whatever we can to connect to them. And I think if that is not a possibility, then hopefully to read stories about them, and maybe get a sense of our own, not just the watersheds that we're living in, but the watersheds that we've come from as well, and maybe have some of that family history of watershed, mm-hmm. to grow some roots to connect to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's always the conflict between hard science, bringing good data, having a really focused scientific inquiry into watersheds, and then being able to relate that through literature. Do you see that as a way to really bring in people who are not engaged in watershed issues right now? A lot of people don't even relate or know that they can relate to watersheds.
Yeah, so how do we get people to relate to watersheds when most of the information about watersheds is coming from the hard sciences? And I think part of it, I hope, is in the hands of those scientists, as more and more of them are becoming more familiar with these other ways of writing and other outlets for writing. And then I think it's also in the hands of writers to approach the sciences and to try to understand those concepts and then pull them into the stories that we tell.
So in your discipline of philosophy and social ecology, do you work with communities? Are there ways that you would translate that information?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to work with communities and bring watershed into that work, be it on just basic school levels, K through 12, teaching to get kids out into watersheds in that sense, but also to put that into the literature that these children are reading, and then I think that's a good space to start the community activity around watersheds, and then that spreads, of course, into families, and then into the larger communities. I think that's one way to do it, and then of course I think of Reno, the town that I did my undergraduate work in, and is sort of home. And as a community, we've really brought new life to the Truckee River that flows through our town. And I think that's another way to do it, which isn't necessarily in the schools, but it's still getting families to get to experience the river, to have events that celebrate the river. But I think it's also really key to do it on a personal level. So however people can experience a watershed, I think is.
So when you talk to your peers, your colleagues at the university, do you get a sense that they're connected, that they think about where their water comes from?
Do I think that my peers are connected to their watershed? I think I'm lucky that my peers are. I think that's probably, those are the people that I'm talking to. I think on a larger scale, there's a lot of work to be done there. I think it's easy. I think as much as we move around in university life, and to get to a new place and not have a sense of the natural history of that place and the watershed that we're pulling from, and oftentimes we're not pulling from the immediate watershed that we're living in, and I think it takes a bit of digging to find out where our water's coming from all the time. So I think there's work to be done on that.
So is there anything else you'd like to talk to us about healthy watersheds and the future?
No, I can't think of anything.
It's fine.
Let me see, just general.
Are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. Yeah, I think there's a lot of reason to hope. I think there's a lot of reason to despair as well, but if there was nothing, if we had no reason to despair, we would have, of course, no reason to be so hopeful, because there's so many things to work on. So I think there's a place for everyone to be doing something. There's so much space for work to be done. So I'm hopeful that that in my career I'll be able to find that, and that everyone else will have the opportunity to do that too. It's such a big front. The environmental movement is so large, and healthy watersheds seem like a fundamental part to that. So I'm hopeful.